I've been a fan of Jon Stewart's fake news show, The Daily Show, for more than 15 years. His irreverent and incisive interviews have often made him a more reliable news source than many of the professional journalists on TV. He's interviewed presidents, authors, heads of state, movie stars, rock stars, religious leaders, and corporate giants, but I've only seen Jon Stewart awestruck one time, and that was when he was interviewing a 15-year-old girl. And there are none of his famous guests whom I'd love to have a chance to meet personally as much as that 15-year-old, now 16-year-old girl from Pakistan, a survivor of a Taliban assassination attempt, Malala Yousuf. She was only 11 years old when she began anonymously writing a blog for the BBC about what it's like to be a girl under the Taliban. But after a couple of years, she began to do TV interviews and her anonymity went away. And so when she was 15, when she was on board a school bus, an assassin boarded the bus, went up and shot her 3 times. One bullet going through the side of her head and then lodging into her shoulder. Malala had undergone a number of surgeries and was hospitalized for more than 4 months before she could even begin the recovery of learning how to speak again. She has been somewhat disfigured by the attack. She suffered hearing loss. She still has pretty tough speech problems. But a little more than a year after she was shot, she was sitting in the Oval Office of the White House trying to educate President Barack Obama about terrorism. Though a faithful Muslim herself, Malala has been a victim of Islamic extremism in a way that very few human beings who have survived can fully understand. If anyone has a reason to see an aggressive prosecution of the war on terrorism, who has a bigger claim than Malala Yousuf? After the meeting, she told reporters, "I also expressed my concerns that drone attacks are fueling terrorism." She explained to our president, "Innocent victims are killed in these acts, and they lead to resentment among Pakistani people. If we refocus our efforts on education, it would make a big impact." Malala says that she would one day like to be the Prime Minister of Pakistan, which I suppose is a worthy enough goal since our Constitution would keep her from running for President of the United States, which is where I'd like to see her. In the Bible, blindness is used metaphorically to represent those who can see but who refuse to see. Now, modern readers can be ridiculously fact-literal about biblical stories, and they read them in a way that necessitates that it happened exactly the way that it's described. And by doing that, they become blind themselves. If you've seen this movie, Son of God, that's out, I don't know if there's a revival going on in Hollywood right now. They're doing the Noah story, and they're doing a movie, Proof of Heaven, because a 4-year-old under anesthesia during surgery knows things that no one else knows. That there's this whole magical, superstitious, religious message that's being forwarded out of Hollywood now because people insist on taking some of these stories literally. But John, the gospel writer John, takes a lot of precious ink and paper. Long descriptions in that time period would be fairly rare because the cost of a book goes up like crazy. But he tells a long narrative that was really too long for us to read in church today. We just read a part of it, though I suspect that you know the rest of the story well. If John were just trying to list miracles in a historical way that would prove to readers that Jesus had magical powers, he would just say, 30 years ago, Jesus cured a blind man named John Smith who lived on Main Street in Jerusalem. You would tie it down to a particular person, time, and place. But John's not trying to prove that Jesus had magical powers. He's telling us a story about blindness. The early part of John's gospel is full of brilliantly written metaphorical narratives, starting with Jesus' conversation with Nicodemus, and then the Samaritan woman, and then these stories about bread. But then we come down to John 9, and here is this deeply ironic narrative, because the story is crowded with bumbling disciples, gossiping neighbors, judgmental religious leaders, and a backstabbing group of family members, so that it seems like the blind man in the story is the only person in Jerusalem who can see, and everyone else is blind to reality and blinded by their prejudices. I'm convinced that what John wanted to tell us about Jesus is that Jesus was able to see the blind man as a human being who was in need of real help. And everyone else saw him. The neighbors saw him as an opportunity for pity or for gossip, or the religious leaders saw him as a theological problem to be debated. And the family saw him as a burden, as an embarrassment, as an indictment. And folks, if we are in any way followers of Jesus, we should see ourselves in this narrative and see how by labeling people that we dismiss them. By putting people into categories, it makes us easy to discard them. What we want as followers of Jesus is to learn how to see what he saw, to see the way that he saw, so that we can look through those learned prejudices to actually see the human beings involved. Sean sometimes sings a song for us here from the 1940s Broadway musical South Pacific that says, "You have to be carefully taught. You have to be taught to hate and fear. You have to be taught from year to year. It's got to be drummed in your little ear. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be taught to be afraid of people whose eyes are oddly made and people whose skin's a different shade. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be taught before it's too late, before you're 6 or even 8, to hate all the people your relatives hate. You have to be carefully taught." Certainly, Malala's parents deserve no small amount of credit for helping their daughter to see the absurdity of the prejudice against females in conservative Islam, or more accurately, the version of Islam as practiced by people who were already misogynist. I believe that Islam is more inherently egalitarian in matters of gender prejudice between men and women than is either Judaism or Christianity. Islam inherently is more gender neutral and more advanced than any other of the ancient world religions, but the way it gets expressed is a way that Muhammad would have rejected 500 years ago. After all, in Muhammad's house, he was illiterate and his wife was the one that could read and write. She was the one that had an education, and if it hadn't been for Muhammad's wife, there wouldn't be a Quran. But like the song says, prejudice have to be taught, and they usually have to be taught early to make them stick. By the time they are teenagers, most girls in the Middle East have come to accept a secondary role in society, even to the point of defending misogyny. Just as most of us here who grew up in a segregated school system in the United States learned to accept that races were somehow supposed to be kept apart. When I was a kid working in the fields in Kentucky farms, we worked blacks and whites side by side, and then on Monday morning we went to different schools, but we always had, and we accepted it as reality. There is no logical reason why any of us here who are straight ever wasted a single second of our lives, an ounce of our energy, worrying about what gay people do. I have realized as an adult, as a single heterosexual, that now it helps my odds to improve if more men would be gay. I want every single man to come out of the closet and get out of the competition with me. It's going to improve my chances. We can all have an innately negative reaction to something that is unfamiliar to us. For whatever reason, we think it's okay to eat chickens and not cats. You know, we have just a gut level reaction to certain decisions that our culture has made. But the constant repetition of a particular kind of prejudice is what blinds us. That is what makes us believe that those prejudices are not even up for conversation anymore. They just are what they are. They are just right. I lift up Malala in part because I'm in love with her. I just think she's the most fabulous human being in the world. But at the age of 16, still recovering from having been shot at point-blank range in the face by a crazy fanatic, she, as a little girl, can sit down in the Oval Office with the first black president of the United States, a man who has lived abroad, who grew up without a father, who has suffered as a victim of racial prejudice, but a man who still seems to believe that sending his flying assassin robots into foreign nations and killing innocent civilians in the process of killing suspected terrorists will somehow stop terrorism. I understand that there are dangerous people in the world, and the use of drones has all kinds of advantages over launching most other more conventional forms of military warfare. But once we became capable of sending our flying robots into countries to take out a particular individual without risking any of our own soldiers, then it became way too easy to move from what would have been considered political assassination 10 years ago into acceptable forms of warfare without any risk to American lives. And then, when used so often and without any way of isolating the suspected terrorists from the children that happen to be playing in the street in front of the house, or the mothers who are out hanging out the laundry behind the house, or the men that are sitting squatted around a coffee pot in the street, that all of these people die when that missile is shot into that house, what Malala is trying to explain to our president, who is apparently blind to the effect of this, is that all of those innocent civilians that get killed in every one of those attacks have brothers and sisters and cousins and friends and people that live down the street, all of whom, in a flash of a bomb, become willing to be recruited as the next generation of terrorists. That what we are doing causes terrorism. So Malala even offers him an option. What if you use some of your resources on education? As Colonel Ron Hertenstein liked to say, I've never heard of a terrorist that had a good job. If you have a good education, that is the best buffer against terrorism that we could offer, and it's much, much less expensive. She has lived there. Malala knows the Taliban has no greater deterrent than the voice of this 16-year-old girl who is, I believe, the future Prime Minister of Pakistan. Realistically, and I hate to say this, I take no joy in saying this, but the Taliban's best recruiter of new terrorists is President Barack Obama. He is doing more to turn citizens towards the Taliban, and Malala is the greatest threat that the Taliban faces. I think that being a disciple of Jesus is a matter of learning how to see again, to let go of the assumed prejudices that are oftentimes born in fear. Why are we willing to execute this war on terrorism the way that we do? Because we're scared. We're scared. We were scared by 9/11. We're still scared of the potential of irrational terrorist attacks, and so we are creating terrorism by fighting terrorism militarily. But we still have to fight against the blindnesses that we have, most of which are rooted in fear. Blindnesses of prejudice, of ignorance, of racism, of sexism, of classism. Believing that Jesus was born of a virgin, died a substitutionary death to save our souls. Believing that he was divine. Believing that he walked on water. Believing that he made blind people see. That, forgive me for saying it quite so bluntly, that stuff has more to do with being gullible and maybe a little bit slow. But being able to see through prejudice, That's where Jesus is. That's where being a Christian is. Being able to see through the prejudices that we were taught, being able to see the oppression of the poor, the abuses of corporations that we've been taught to bow down to in the name of patriotism and democracy and freedom and the American way. That's what it means to be a person after the heart of Jesus. So you want to learn how to be a better Christian? Unfortunately, right now, one of the best examples is a Muslim little girl, because I think she can see better than we can.
You've been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at reverenddray@aol.com for more information.